Afternoon. My name is Gloria Borher, and I'm a resident here at Heritage Point. And it's my privilege and honor to present today a letter that was written by a gentleman who was at D-Day 1944 on June 6, when the Allied troops invaded France. In World War II, invaded Europe, made the landing at Normandy Beach in France. His name was Pryor. He was, and as a father, he had a daughter named Ellie, who was going with her young family, husband and two children, to Europe, and was going to be at Normandy Beach, and asked her father to write some reminiscences of his being on June the 6th, one of the soldiers who landed on Normandy Beach in World War II. And this is the copy of the letter he sent to his daughter Ellie. And because I was so impressed with it, I felt that it should be conveyed to the rest of you, and I will read it as if I was Ellie, his daughter. It's dated March 6, 2002. Dear Ellie, you have asked me to recount what I did on D-Day and in the period immediately following. I will do so with two misgivings. One, in truth, I did not do anything worth recounting, nothing heroic or unusual. And two, we are talking about events which occurred more than 57 years ago. Memory, as we know, is a perishable item and a commodity which does not improve with age. What was once remembered with vivid clarity becomes murky with the passage of years. Also, memory is selective. Trivial events are remembered, while important events are forgotten. Nevertheless, despite these considerations, which cause me some hesitation, I will do my best to put down accurately, as I remember them, the facts associated with my landing in France in June of 1944 and the period immediately following. Pat, Jeff, Andy, and you will soon be visiting Utah Beach. It is a place which occupies the niche in my personal story like none other. I'm delighted that you will soon be walking the terrain that is not only hallowed in American history, but in my personal history as well, even though all I did was go where I was ordered and do what I was ordered to do. I landed at Utah Beach the morning of June 6, 1944, sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock a.m. H hour took place several hours earlier, at 6:30 a.m. Even before H hour, in the earlier morning hours, while it was still dark, paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne Divisions started to land in Normandy at various places along the beach and the coast, including Saint-Mère-Anglaise, just inland from what became to be known as Utah Beach. My outfit, the 1st Engineer Brigade, commanded by Colonel Eugene Caffey, was part of the 7th Corps commanded by General Lawton Collins. We were part of the General Omar Bradley's 1st Army. Some units of the 1st Engineers landed on Utah Beach at H Hour. Others came ashore on Omaha Beach, a short distance to the east. The fighting at Omaha Beach was much more intense than at Utah Beach, and the casualties were much higher. Others landed on the British landed even further east with other Allied troops, and they were at beaches called Sword, Juno, and Gold. So it was our sheer good fortune that we were assigned to Utah Beach. On June 5th, my outfit was in the marshalling area outside a channel port, which I never learned the name of. Security was extremely tight. We were not told where we were or where we were going. The entire area was under surveillance, nobody in, nobody out, and we could not write letters. Toward dusk, we were told to get ready to move on in full gear, and we marched out of the marshalling area on foot toward a waiting landing ship, and it was called a landing ship infantry, and the initials, as I refer to it from now on, were LSI. That was our boat, which would take us to France. It was during this march that I was going past an apartment house that was draped with the blackout curtains, which was the law in England as far as the windows all had to be covered with black curtains. But a young girl had pulled up in the window and on the ground floor, and as we passed, she had a sign and revealed it to us, which read, "Good luck, Yanks." Excuse me, I need to take a little sip. Occasionally, I do have to stop for water. Well, let me just make sure I only turned one page. Many other soldiers had preceded us to the LSI, and many followed us. It was an all-night constant plane traffic overhead, with American and British planes going and returning to and from the continent in what seemed like unending waves. During the night, we were not told what was happening in the war, but we had a pretty good idea that at the long-expected invasion had begun or was about to begin, and the LSI was our way in the early morning hours of June 6th of crossing the channel. And we did that when the darkness lifted and we could make out naval vessels of all kinds on all sides and as far as the eye could see. There were more ships than I had ever before seen at one time, at one place in my entire life. Shortly after we got underway, an announcement was made on the loudspeaker of the LSI that during the night, American and British paratroopers had dropped into French territory, and Allied soldiers had begun landing on the French coast. We cheered the news and the announcement as if our home team had just won the World Series. But I am sure that none of us could resist wondering what would befall us in the next few hours. Where were we going? What would awaiting us? Would we ever reach France? On the trip over, would we be vulnerable to German planes, mines, submarines, and long-range artillery? The announcement on the LSI confirmed what most of us had already guessed. That was the beginning of the long-awaited invasion. There were several other telltale signs pointing in that direction. A few days earlier, when we moved from St. Ansel in Cornwall to the marshalling area near an undisclosed port on the Channel coast, just before we left the marshalling area on the night of June the 5th, our CO had read to us from General Eisenhower a message wishing us Godspeed as we embarked on our great crusade. So it was rather clear to us as we marched on to the LSI, even before the announcement of the speaker, that after countless days leading up to June 6th, guessing the invasion would begin had become a great pastime. Some of the men were placing bets on the exact date. Now the doubt and the guessing were at an end. On all sides you could hear soldiers saying, "This is it! This is it!" You don't have to ask what it was. As we neared the coast of France, we could see smoke billowing from some of the naval vessels in the Channel, followed by flashes of light along a long swath of the shoreline, and the sound of explosions. It was an incredible scene. So many planes overhead, bursting bombs filled the air and lit the sky ahead of us, knowing that in a few minutes we would no longer be spectators but full participants. Surely, and without question, the scene in the Channel as our LSI made way to the French coast was the most memorable scene I have ever witnessed, up to then or since. I can still remember saying to my buddy Hal Sutliff, who was standing next to me, and as I said to him, I can remember it was 100 years from now, school children are going to be studying what we are doing and are now a part of. And he agreed. When we were about 200 yards offshore, a number of amphibious vessels came swarming to ours from the beach. By squads, we all clambered down the rope ladders on the side of the LSI into the vessels which had practiced, and that was something we had practiced many times before in our training exercises. The acronym for these amphibious vessels were DUKW, so of course they were known as ducks. Other outfits were taken ashore on larger amphibious vessels, and they were called Higgins boats. The helmets of all the soldiers of the 1st Engineers had a blue half circle painted across their front. We carried our weapons. Mine was an M1 Garand rifle with bayonet, which we hooked and hung onto our ammunition belts. In addition, on our belt was a gas mask and a canteen of water. Inside our ammo belts, we carried ammunition, penicillin powder, and other first aid medication. Whether or not we carried our rolled up sleeping bags on our shoulders, or were they distributed once we got to the beach, I cannot remember, as spite of my best efforts. Excuse me, I'm going to have a sip. As we departed from the LSI into the ducks, and as the ducks moved toward the shore, we could see that the tide was low, disclosing hundreds of underwater barbed wire obstacles that had been set there by the Germans. And we were very close to the shoreline, but we had not yet reached it. The ducks stopped, and we were given the order to dismount, move in, and we were in knee-deep water. Ahead of us, we could see soldiers from the 4th Division mopping up, having just about cleared the beach before we landed. We could also see several dozen German prisoners on their knees, with U.S. soldiers standing over them with rifles, and from that water's edge to the seawall, the beach, I'm sorry, from the water's edge to the seawall, the beach rose up to a hill, and it was quite a climb. As we made our way up, we could hear and feel a two-way artillery duel. Inland, the German batteries were shelling positions as us on the beach, while the Allied cruisers and the destroyers standing offshore behind us were lobbing shells over our positions into the Germans, who were retreating from Saint-Pierre-Anglais, a few miles ahead of us. We could hear the rifle and the machine gun fire in front of us, and between the seawall and the soldiers that had preceded us, the 4th and the 82nd Division had done an excellent job of wiping out enemy machine gun and small arms fire on Utah Beach, which meant that we only had to contend with some mortar and artillery fire, and this was not concentrated, heavy, or sustained. Some of the 4th Division soldiers on the beach were firing mortars inland. Others were climbing up and over the seawall, which was, and probably still is, behind the beach. We could also see wounded soldiers on stretchers and some covered bodies of a few soldiers who had been killed in the earlier fighting before we had landed. Slightly behind the seal wall, there had been a German pillbox with machine guns trained right on the beach in front of us. And by the time we landed, the pillbox had been cleared and taken out by soldiers of the 4th Division, and the German soldiers who had earlier manned it were either dead or taken prisoners. Sporadically, we could see and hear flashes and explosions in front of us as German batteries from behind the seawall shelled the beach where we were landing. But it was not heavy or continuous. Allied fighter bombers were dropping bombs. I think I read this before. But it was all friendly fire, and I would guess that the enemy ordnance which landed closest to me was about 30 yards, which means that we were very lucky to be stationed where we were. By comparison, 7 weeks later, on July 25th, when we were in foxholes outside St. Louis, the greatest Allied bombardment of the war up to that time took place, and the Allied bombers and the so-called friendly fire dropped just as close to us as the enemy bombs and fire at Utah Beach, if not closer. After landing and moving up the beach to the seawall, my squad was ordered immediately to start preparing to cordon off several German prisoners who had surrendered before our arrival, and to prepare for an unexpected influx of more prisoners. And other squads were ordered to mark off areas on the beach where the ammo and the gasoline would be stored. As we started to carry out our orders, somebody barked at us, "Let's go, let's go, let's get a move on." And it was Colonel Eugene Caffey, commander of the 1st Engineers. And he was standing next to somebody whom I recognized from newspaper photographs. It was Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., eldest son of President Theodore Roosevelt, cousin of FDR, and second in command of the 4th Division. A few days later, he died of a heart attack. When I saw him standing next to Colonel Caffey, General Roosevelt was leaning on a cane, and I wondered how he had managed to pass the Army physical if he was unable to stand without a cane. Every once in a while we would be told that some German soldiers had been captured, and we would take our way over into a designated spot, pick up the prisoners, and separate them from their officers, and take them back to the pens which were being erected on the beach. Enlisted men were separated from their officers. Sometimes we would escort the prisoners to a place where they were being debriefed by the Counterintelligence Corps. At first, all the prisoners were Germans. But as the days wore on, many of the prisoners turned out to be Russian, Ukrainians, and Poles, who had been captured on the Eastern Front and pressed into serving as labor battalions for the Germans and the German army. Apparently, they were only too eager to surrender. Because we were so near the water and the sand was so loose, it was very difficult to have foxholes except up the beach near the seawall. So on the night of June the 6th, we were in 4 hours on and 4 hours off, which meant that we were 4 hours on duty and then we had 4 hours off guard to have some sleep time, which most of the time was impossible because of the increasing drone of the airplanes overhead. And the night I took my 4 hours off on the beach in a sleeping bag just in front of the seawall, where the monument to the 1st Engineers is now, the 1st Engineers Brigade now stands. The Allies had such complete control of the air that I do not remember a single instance when a German plane strafed us or dropped bombs in our area. In the next few days, a constant stream of Allied traffic landed on the beach. Tanks, trucks, bulldozers, and other earth-moving equipment, ambulances, and American, French, and Polish soldiers. They all moved from the beach to the seawall and then up onto the causeway, which led inland from the beach and which kept being shelled by the Germans as they retreated from Saint-Mère-en-Glace. Excuse me again. Shortly after landing, we had learned that the general area in which we found ourselves was called Utah Beach, and the specific area was called, as I now remember it, Uncle Red Beach. My outfit was given various assignments, most always relating to picking up, guarding, and transporting prisoners of war. From time to time, we were ordered to move over the seawall to where the soldiers of the 4th Division and the 82nd Airborne were firmly in control of Saint-Mère-en-Glace, and we were to pick up prisoners, bring them back to the beach, stand guard over them, and get them out to the boats, which would take them back to England, to the United States and Canada. We also were assigned to guard duty at night to protect against any German soldiers seeking to infiltrate our lines and to mount a counterattack. Sometimes armed with electric torches, we were tasked to regulate traffic on the beach, which could sometimes get a little hectic. If several ships were disgorging their personnel and equipment at the same time, it was pretty hectic. After about 2 weeks on the beach, we were ordered to pack up and move inland. We walked off the beach through La Madeleine, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, where we pitched our tents in fields for a night. We combed the area for infiltrators and for German stragglers who might have an idea of causing mischief behind the lines. We also took prisoners of war back to the beach. La Madeleine was a very little town and we did not see any inhabitants. Sainte-Marie-du-Mont was much larger, and when we moved to a field outside of Saint-Mère-en-Glace, which was a very nice-sized town with a beautiful church, which became famous in the lore of World War II because during the night, a few hours before H hour, while paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne were landing behind the beach and behind the German coastal defenses, a U.S. paratrooper landed on one of the spires of this beautiful church in the center of town and managed to remain motionless and inert so that the Germans, who were at that time controlling the town, would think that he had died. He spent several hours in that awkward position before he was lifted down by U.S. soldiers who entered the town and captured it late that night on June the 6th. The incident was depicted in the motion picture The Longest Day, in which red buttons played the part of the soldier who was impaled on the church spire in Sainte-Mère-Anglaise, hence Red's Beach. Looking at the map, La Madeleine, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, and Sainte-Mère-Anglaise were not in a straight line, which makes me now wonder why we moved in that manner. But there is no doubt that we went through those towns in that order after we left Utah Beach. In the following days, we kept moving through Normandy, sometimes close to artillery and other times at quite a distance. By now, we were able to dig foxholes and sometimes put up pup tents. Our main job during this period was to round up and ship out the PWs, prisoners of war, while the Germans retreated across terrain which is known in French as bocage country, which means very high hedges of such strength that even our heaviest tanks could not knock them over or uproot them. The hedges gave the Germans beautiful cover for picking off American soldiers advancing to the east. So you could correctly guess that we were very careful and took every precaution as we slowly made our way through the hedges. My father was a wonderful storyteller, and I can hear his voice as I read these words. We kept moving east and south into Belgium at St. Vith during the Battle of the Bulge, and into Germany at Trier, where, as we came into town, the MPs told us that there was an operating brewery nearby, so you can certainly guess that we got pretty sloshed that night. We kept moving east in Germany until we came to Weimar, close to the Buchenwald concentration camp. I am sure you remember my telling you the story of how we transported townspeople from Weimar back into the Buchenwald camp, where the cadavers were still piled up and where the commandant's wife, the infamous Elsie Koch, had made a lampshade out of the tattoos on the skin of those inmates. And all the townspeople pretended to be shocked, like Claude Rains in Casablanca, that such horrible deeds had taken place so close to them, and they had not the vaguest idea or inkling of that, etc., etc., etc. Of course, they were lying through their teeth. But we have now come a long distance from Utah Beach, and the area in which you are mainly interested. And you know about the fact that after VE Day, my outfit was redeployed to Marseille for retraining, preparatory to be sent to the Pacific Theater of Operations, which happily never happened, came to pass because VJ Day occurred in the interim. And while we were passing time in Marseille and the Army was deciding what to do with us, the process of demobilization began. Soldiers who had the most combat and service points would be demobilized first. I was a high point man because of the length of my overseas service and the fact that I had participated in 5 major battles. So I expected to be sent back to the States for demobilization relatively early. One day, while I was awaiting the news that I could go home and be demobilized, I received a telegram from my mother delivered by the Red Cross, which said, and I still remember it exactly, "Father dead, funeral Thursday. Can you come home? Love, Mother." I was saddened beyond description. I had dearly loved and greatly admired my father. His life had truly been a profile in quiet courage. He had overcome many challenges and obstacles in his own life, and by example had set the highest standards to which I could aspire in mine. My grief was sharpened then, when in the days following the receipt of my mother's telegram, I received several letters from my father, which he had written before the heart attack that had caused his death. The Army was unable to move fast enough to fly me back in time for the funeral. But about a week later, it arranged for me to be flown home on a DC-3, which made refueling stops in the Azores and Bermuda before landing in Washington. On arriving in Washington, I immediately telephoned my mom, whom I had not seen and whom I had not spoken in 8 months. We agreed that she would meet me at LaGuardia Field and at LaGuardia Airport. A few hours later, an emotional reunion did take place. Thus ended, in late September of 1945, the story which had begun on June 6, 1944, on a bright and sunny day in the English Channel, a day which is now known as D-Day. I hope that Pat, Jeff, Andy, and you will enjoy your trip to Normandy, and that you will find interesting the Utah Beach and St. Marie and St. Dumont and Marie Anglaise areas, which for a few unforgettable days and nights in 1944 was the place I called home. Love to you all, and bon voyage. Come home safely. That letter touched me very deeply when I was able to read it, and I thought it would certainly be worthwhile to present as a program on D-Day. And I have an additional comment that I would like to add. You know, the men and women who fought in our military services in World War II were great people, and if they were fortunate to return, came back to be called the greatest generation by Tom Brokaw in a book which he wrote describing the advances that these men and women made in peacetime. They went back to school on the GI Bill, and they bought homes on the GI Bill. And they went back to the farms, and they went into family businesses, and they became entrepreneurs of their own. And they became teachers and professors and policemen and firemen and lawyers and doctors and engineers, and the growth and the beautiful life that we remember when we were raising our children, and now the life that we have here and see our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren enjoying. It gives me a feeling of thankfulness to be able to share this event with you. By the way, just as an aside, Pete Pryor, the author of this particular letter, did become a lawyer, and he was a prominent lawyer in the entertainment and musical Hollywood field. And among his clients was Duke Ellington, Simon and Garfunkel, Bob Dylan, Jerry Lewis, Tony Bennett, and very typical of all the things that people are able to achieve in this great country of ours. Which makes me want to close with a Shehekianu prayer. And if you care to join me, Shehekianu, Fekiamanu, the Higianu, Lazman Hazer. We are blessed, we are thankful that we have been enabled to reach this season. Thank you.